This time my father brought me 30 steel scrubbers and challenged me. He looked at them and asked, "What could you possibly make out of these to surprise us?" I immediately accepted the challenge. First, I built a steel container and started packing the steel scrubbers inside. I pushed them in one after another, hammering them down as tightly as possible to compress everything inside the container. Eventually, this is what I ended up with. Once the container was completely packed, I sealed it shut. Then I fired up my charcoal forge and placed the container deep into the hot coals. When it became extremely hot, I started hammering it from every side, carefully compressing everything inside. I continued heating and hammering until I could feel that the steel scrubbers had fused together into one solid mass. At that point, I allowed the container to cool and removed the outer shell. Inside was a solid, massive steel billet. I welded a long steel handle onto it, fired up the forge again, and continued forging. This part took me the entire day because I don't have a hydraulic press. Everything you see here is forged completely by hand with my hammer. First, I flattened the billet into a plate approximately 4 millimeters thick. Then I forged the blade tip and shaped the section where the handle would eventually be attached. By the end of the day, this was what the rough forged blade looked like. The next morning, I moved over to the belt grinder. The sides were still uneven from all the hammer blows, so my first job was to flatten and level both surfaces. Then I drew the final knife shape directly onto the steel and started refining the contours. There were a few tight areas I couldn't reach with the belt grinder, so I finished those sections by hand using a metal file. Next, I marked and drilled the holes for the handle. I also added 3 decorative grooves along the spine of the blade using a hand file. Now it was time for one of the most difficult and important stages of the entire build, grinding the bevels. This part requires a lot of precision because the bevels have a huge effect on both the appearance and cutting performance of the finished knife. Once the bevels were complete, I continued refining the blade on the belt grinder all the way to 240 grit. Now it was ready for heat treatment. I heated the blade to approximately 850 degrees Celsius, judging the temperature by the color of the glowing steel. Then I quickly quenched it in oil. Now the steel was hardened and much stronger. After heat treatment, I started sanding again from 240 grit and gradually worked my way up to 1500 grit. Then I cleaned the blade and placed it into ferric chloride for several minutes. And with the blade finished, it was time to make the handle. I cut 2 scales from a beautiful piece of Greek walnut and drew the handle shape onto them. Using a 36 grit belt, I shaped both pieces on the belt grinder. Then I assembled everything using epoxy and brass pins and left it to cure overnight. The next day, once the epoxy had completely hardened, I returned to the belt grinder and refined the handle until everything was perfectly aligned. After that, I finished the wood by hand, sanding it to 220 grit. Finally, I applied a protective wax to bring out the beautiful walnut grain and protect the wood from moisture. I sharpened the blade, and this is the final result, from 30 ordinary steel scrubbers to a completely handmade knife. If you think I won this challenge, make sure to subscribe to my channel.